afternoon, Council. Good afternoon, Ms. James, and others who have joined us here for this proceeding today. Couple quick reminders. This is a lot of the content that we covered yesterday, but for folks who are new, just want to make sure that we are walking through that. So this is day 2 of our Amotion proceeding. And as I explained yesterday, and as is in the actual Amotion rules that have been adopted by the City of Monroe, Councilmember James is entitled to this hearing, a full and fair hearing, as a matter of due process. So that's why we're here today. The city, again, has the burden of proving the alleged misconduct, and that just cause exists to remove the council member. This is not a court of law. This is a different type of proceeding, so the rules of evidence do not apply to this hearing. Yesterday, I mentioned this to folks, but again, since we have new visitors in the room, we ask that you refrain from live streaming or recording the hearing. This hearing will be made available ultimately through the normal means by the City of Monroe. Videographer is here in the back of the room who is also recording. So there are actually 2 recordings of the hearing that are happening by videotape. We have a court reporter here with us today. She was here yesterday. So there will be a verbatim transcript of the proceeding that is prepared to accurately reflect everyone's testimony. Masks, you hear me struggling with mine. Always do when we first begin. The City of Monroe has implemented a mask rule. So face masks are required that cover the nose and mouth for all individuals within the City Hall, including during this hearing. When folks are testifying, if they feel comfortable, they can remove their mask. We've set this up to have enough space for people to feel comfortable to do that if they so choose. We fully expect that this will be an orderly meeting with no disruptions. It's an open meeting, so anybody's welcome to attend. But if there are disruptive individuals, they will be removed pursuant to the statutes in North Carolina. Witness sequestration. This is not going to be as big an issue today, but just so that folks understand, if there are any witnesses that will be testifying, they need to not be inside this chamber during the course of that testimony so that their testimony is not influenced by the testimony of others. Preliminary issues. All right. An issue arose yesterday concerning a potential inconsistency in the rules. I believe you brought that up, Council Hageman. And the rules actually state that they're in Rule Roman numeral 3B. It refers to a series of written findings of fact, conclusions of law, and recommendations. And then in Rule Roman numeral 4A, it refers to a proposed set of findings of fact, conclusions of law, and recommendations. By email correspondence to all of the council, we reached out to try to get feedback from the city attorney, Mr. Shahkan. He did provide his perspective by means of email. We will include that email in the proceedings of this hearing. But Mr. Shahkan indicated that your intention was for the hearing officer to present proposed findings of fact, proposed conclusions of law, and proposed recommendations consistent with that communication. Mr. Shahkan, is there anything you want to add in the course of this proceeding to address that?
No, Madam Hearing Officer, we appreciate you giving us an opportunity to ask some input.
Yep, no worries. That was, by the way, consistent with our view as well. Oh, it feels so much better when I have this off. I have to get used to it. I have to get used to projecting to all of you with the mask on. So much easier to do this without the mask, but of course we have to stay safe in this environment. So, affidavits, that was a topic of conversation yesterday. Want to just revisit that? Councilmember James, you discussed the submission of 3 character affidavits yesterday. We understand that those affidavits were fine for counsel for the city. We just wanted to touch base to see if that was going to be it, if that was the conclusion of affidavits, or if there were more coming in.
No, it's the 3, and we've marked them as council members' exhibits CC, DD, and EE, and we'll hand them up before the proceedings conclude. I do want to make sure I understand the conclusion with respect to the potential conflict in the rules.
Yes.
As I read the city's email this morning, the city believes that the rules say not just that your findings, everything is proposed, but not just that, but that you actually have discretion as to whether to issue any recommendation at all.
Right.
We do not interpret the rules that way. I think the rules are quite clear that you are supposed to issue a recommendation. We've presented evidence with that understanding in mind. We have based our entire case with that understanding in mind, and we would ask that the interpretation of the rules be that while your findings and conclusions are proposed and while your recommendation is certainly not final, some recommendation must be issued as to whether removal should occur.
So it's a fair point. I took that to mean, and Mr. Shopman, please feel free to weigh in. I took that to mean that there's certainly a circumstance where the evidence could be presented and the recommendation was such that it was inconclusive or that we were not in a position to suggest one way or the other what the council should do based on the record evidence. That's how I interpreted your email, as opposed to just deferring on a recommation, but let's get clarification around it.
Well, and respectfully, I would just suggest that the city has the burden here. So if in other words, you are not convinced by the evidence, in my view, the recommendation must be do not remove. That's my understanding of why they have the burden of both proof and persuasion in this proceeding.
On behalf of the city, I would note in terms of behalf of the city council, and I'll defer to Mr. Hageman on behalf of the city otherwise, we beg to differ with Mr. Call's position. And I would just point out that you pointed out a position that I agree with, and I make it a point to not disagree with someone when they're right. So we agree with you that there may be a situation in when a recommendation may not even be appropriate, but we don't know if that would take place in that situation, but that's why we've said we think the rules show some deference, but that'll be up to you, and I believe Mr. Hageman may have a point he wishes to make.
So maybe I can bridge these two together. We would concede that if the conclusions of law did not conclude that the legal standard for removal has not been met, you cannot make a recommendation to remove. I'm comfortable, though, that if you conclude that the standard has been met based on the proposed findings of fact, that the hearing officer has the range of recommendations, which we either recommend not to or to leave it to the discretion of council, because ultimately I believe that even if the standard is met, the council still retains the discretion on the sanction.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed. So understand, I will take all of these arguments by council under advisement. At this point, we just don't know how this is going to shake itself out. So if this becomes an issue as we get to phase 2, we can revisit this certainly on the record. I think it is less likely that set of circumstances would present themselves just as a factual matter, but we need to get to the conclusion of the hearing in order to reach any sort of conclusion as to the outcomes.
So I certainly agree with that, and I'm sorry, I do not mean to take time away from the presentation of evidence today, but everything that I do in this proceeding, which I understand to be the full record that council will consider, is geared toward what is it that you're going to do with this information. And if I don't know what you're going to do with this information, if I don't know whether you're going to make a recommendation or whether it's even required that you do so, then that affects how I structure my argument and the presentation of my evidence today.
Okay, that's fair. So with that in mind, do understand that it is my interpretation of the rules that we are in a position where we should make proposed findings and proposed recommendations. It is our intention to do that. I do not predict that there would be a circumstance where we would not do that. I understand the concern that you are articulating, and I want to make sure that I address any due process concern. We will do that. Now, that recommendation could be any number of things. I cannot predict what that recommendation will be, but we will provide proposed findings of fact and proposed recommendations, with the very important caveat that I think Council Hagelman has pointed out, which is ultimately, again, it's not my decision what folks do, and so there is the discretion of the City Council to be taken into consideration.
And we certainly acknowledge that.
Thank you. All right. So on that issue, I think that we are concluded. There is also was the issue around bias yesterday, and I know that the parties are still talking through this, and there will be briefing on the bias issue. But we did do a little poking around last night, some preliminary research, and because I was concerned about some of the proposals that were being discussed yesterday about reducing the number of individuals who might be in a position to vote on this issue. And obviously there are quorum requirements that I just want to make sure that I raise to the attention of council as you have these conversations about potential remedies around the bias issue. And it appears that the quorum requirement requires 4 city council members and the mayor to engage in a traditional vote to get to a quorum. I'd simply offer that as a consideration for you as you have these discussions.
Can I respond?
Yes, please.
Coincidentally, I just did a 2-hour session for newly elected officials, and my session covered voting and quorum. So what I would submit is that is necessary for a quorum, but you don't defeat a quorum by excusing a member from participating in an item that's on the agenda. So I would agree that in order for the council to have an official meeting, you need a quorum present, but you don't have to have a quorum voting.
Understood.
Okay.
I raise it simply because I suspect where this may go is that you may formulate in a writing a proposed resolution to this issue, and I would like for you to take into consideration the form requirements, so I don't get a writing that is the consented upon agreement that is not going to be consistent with the actual requirements for voting. Let's see. On the issue of the bias briefing, I think this is the last preliminary issue. We had talked about council members submitting her brief by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, February 2nd. And I think we obviously discussed the possibility or likelihood of the city of Monroe submitting a response brief if it wishes to do so. And we are looking at 5 p.m. on Monday, February 7th for the timing of that. Raise that because it then raises a question if we actually have to get together to talk about this or to bring in witnesses. At the close of that, I want the parties to be thinking about when that should happen. I would like over the course of the day, this afternoon today, for you guys to talk to one another and maybe make a proposal to me and to my team about how you'd like to deal with that in the event that we do actually have witness examination for some or all of the witnesses as part of that, the resolution of that bias consideration. Right now we have on the calendar backup dates on the 7th and 8th, but of course, backup date on the 8th, but that's right on the heels of when the briefing would be completed and perhaps not a reasonable date for that kind of an examination. So just raise it as a matter of logistics. All right? All right, so yesterday, the witnesses who were present, and to include you, Councilmember James, were all sworn in. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everybody who was sworn in, if they will be testifying today, of their obligations under that oath. And I know that we have at least one witness who was not sworn in who will be sworn in today. Councilmember James, yesterday afternoon, you testified on direct. So to begin today, the City of Monroe will have the opportunity to cross-examine you. If we don't have any other preliminary matters, I'd like to move to that.
Sure. Just a quick question. Council, were you finished with your direct examination?
Yes, I stopped questioning.
And we are ready to proceed.
Councilmember James, if you can join us. And as your first order of business in your cross-examination, if you can just state for the record that you understand that you're still under oath.
So just state that I'm still on oath.
Yes.
I state that I'm still under oath.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, Ms. James.
Good afternoon.
All right. So I know you were here all day yesterday, and while I was talking a lot, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself to you. So my name is Tara Bright, and I am representing the City of Monroe for purposes of this proceeding. So today I'll be asking you a series of questions related to September 9th, as well as some stuff that you testified to on your direct examination, okay? All right. Additionally, I know that we began your testimony at around 4 p.m. in the afternoon yesterday.
Right.
And before you left, you were instructed not to discuss the substance of your testimony or this matter with anyone.
Yes.
Can you confirm for me that you have not spoken with anybody about the substance of this case between yesterday when we left and today when you've taken the stand?
That's correct.
Alrighty, so additionally, before we kind of dive into the topics that were discussed, because there were a series of topics discussed. I want to make sure that we are on the same page in terms of, if I'm referring to a specific event or a specific timeline and you're unsure or you need clarification as to what I'm asking, please let me know.
Thank you.
Okay, because we want to make sure that the record is clear that, we're talking about the same thing, okay? Alrighty, so at some point in time before coming to today's proceedings, you reviewed the petition regarding this matter, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and the petition contained a series of factual allegations about your conduct on the day and the night of September 9th of 2021, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that day. So on September 9th of 2021, you were in the midst of your 4-year term as a city council member for the city of Monroe.
That's correct.
Okay, and you were also running for mayor of the city of Monroe at that point in time.
That's correct.
Okay, and as a council member and as a mayoral candidate, you are aware that there are certain standards of conduct that pertain to your office, right?
Correct.
Okay, and those standards can be found in, for example, the city's code of ethics, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and you can also find those standards in the city's charter, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so not only were you aware of those standards, but you knew that you needed to abide by them, right?
Correct.
Alrighty, so let's talk about that first standard that I referenced, the code of ethics. So the code of ethics required you as a council member to behave consistently and with respect toward everyone with whom you interacted, right?
Right.
Okay. Additionally, the code of ethics required you to act as the especially responsible citizen whom others can trust and respect, right?
Correct.
Right. It also required you to set a good example for others in the community, right?
Correct.
Right. Additionally, the code of ethics specifically requires you to recognize that as an individual council member, you were not permitted to act on behalf of the council without specific authorization, right?
Correct.
Okay. And without belaboring the point, as an elected official for the city of Monroe, you were aware that Monroe operates under that council manager form of government, right?
Correct.
And that's found in the city charter?
Yes.
Okay, so under that form of government, it is the city manager who has the authority to appoint and remove officers and employees, right?
That's correct.
Okay, it's the city manager who has direct authority over the chief of police, right?
Correct.
Okay, and the city charter explicitly states that neither the mayor, the city council, nor any member thereof shall direct the conduct or activities of any city employee. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's talk about how that applied to you and your conduct on September 9th. So you indicate on your direct examination that on September 9th you were having some sort of mental issue or mental illness that had occurred that night, right?
Correct.
Okay. And you said that it had something to do with exhaustion or stress or something like that, right?
Correct.
Okay, so given this exhaustion and stress, would you say that you accurately recall the details of that night as you sit here today?
Are you asking me, do I recall now what happened? Or?
Yes.
Yes, I understand some of it.
Okay.
Not all of it is clear.
Okay, can you give me an understanding of what is not clear for you that night?
As I watched the video, there's some things that I do remember, but then there's some things I didn't remember that happened when I watched the video.
Okay, so as you sit here today without, relying on the video, do you have a clear recollection of that day and that night?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so on your direct examination, you admitted to your counsel and to everybody who's either reading the record or viewing these proceedings that you fired and promoted a number of officers on the night of September 9th, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and you now know that you do not have the authority to do that, right?
That's correct.
Okay, you admitted that you snatched Captain Boland's badge from his shirt, right?
Correct.
Okay. You also admitted that you yanked Officer Acott's mask off of his face, right?
Correct.
Okay. And during your testimony, you said that you regret having engaged in this conduct, right?
That's correct.
Right. And you told us that that's because the Angelia James who showed up that night is not the Angelia James who, you believe yourself to be, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So let me ask you, as the real Angelia James who sits before us, and who has had months to reflect on that evening, in the months between September 9th and today, have you apologized to Captain Boland for your conduct?
Not directly. I did write into the Inquirer Journal, and I did deliver on my press release an apology, not only to him, but to the entire community.
Okay. So you made statements to the press, but not to the individuals who you offended?
Not the individuals, because I knew this emotion was coming up, and I didn't know how to address the individuals at the time, and that was the purpose of me not going directly to the individual to make a formal apology to them directly.
Got it. So you spoke to the Inquirer, you issued a statement, but have you called Chief Gilliard, who you've known for over 20 years?
I have not. As I stated before, it was just awkward because I really didn't know how to deal with it, his emotions and how he felt. If I would approach him or talk to him, I didn't know how he was going to receive me at the time.
Okay. Have you been to any events or community activities where members of the police force have been present?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
Okay. And at those events, you have not apologized or said that you regretted your conduct. Is that correct?
No, ma'am. I've spoken to him. I speak to him. Just finding the right time to address them is my intent.
Okay. And that hasn't occurred over the last 4 months?
That's correct.
All right. So while we haven't heard from him yet, it is our understanding that you hired Dr. Cotterman to assist you in this matter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So as of right now, as you sit here on the stand, is it your present intention for him to come testify this afternoon?
That's correct.
All right. So let me ask you, this Dr. Cotterman, it's Daniel Cotterman, right?
I just know Dr. Cobb.
You're not sure? Okay.
Yeah.
So Dr. Cotterman was not present to observe your behavior on September 9th, was he?
No, he was not.
Okay. So he was not at the Fairfield Inn.
That's correct.
He was not at your residence.
No, he was not.
And he was not at the hospital that night, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so while Dr. Cotterman was not present to actually observe your behavior, other medical professionals did that night. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so there were EMTs who evaluated you on the 9th at the Fairfield Inn, right?
That's correct.
There were EMTs who came to your residence that night, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and there was a suite of medical doctors and nursing staff who evaluated you and treated you at the hospital that night too. Is that correct?
To be honest, what I can remember at the hospital, I got 2 shots. I got a shot in my arm and my leg. And from that point, I don't know what happened.
Okay, so you know that you had some sort of medical attention at the hospital, is that correct?
Correct.
All right, but instead of calling any of those individuals who actually treated you or observed you, you have decided to call Dr. Cotterman, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so if Dr. Cotterman wasn't present at any of those locations, that would mean he didn't evaluate you on the 9th, right?
That's correct.
Okay, did he evaluate you the next day?
He did not.
Did he evaluate you that month?
He did not.
Okay, between September 9th and the end of the year, did Dr. Cotterman evaluate you?
Dr. Cotterman did not, but it was 2 other people that did.
Okay, who are these 2 other people?
Tia Coleman was one I went to on October the 2nd. She's a therapist. And then on November the 2nd, which was election day, I saw Kimberly Gordon. And both of them saw me. And then also from the video footage, they was able to pull up and see how I acted and how I performed.
Okay, so you indicated Tia Coleman
She's
saw
a
you?
therapist.
Okay, is she testifying on your behalf in these
No, she's
proceedings? Okay, you also indicated Kimberly Gordon.
That's correct.
Okay. Is she testifying on your behalf in
No,
these
but I have
proceedings?
documentation.
Okay, do you have it with you?
I can ask my attorney.
That's quite all right. If you don't intend to call her, I don't know that we need to go down that rabbit hole. But let's stick back with Dr. Cotterman. So the first time that you met him was January of this year, is that correct? Okay, and when you say you met him, all you did was actually talk to him by Zoom, right?
Correct.
Okay, so you were never actually present in the same room with him, is that right?
Yeah, because of COVID.
Well, ma'am, you have been present in person for a lot of different activities since January, isn't that true?
Correct. That wasn't my choice.
Okay. And is Dr. Kotteman coming in today?
Correct.
He'll be physically present in this room?
Correct.
Okay.
He was subpoenaed to come in, correct?
I'm not sure what your attorneys did, but we'll ask Dr. Kotteman those questions. So by the time you spoke with Dr. Kotteman in January of this year, many months had passed, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and whatever mental issue or lapse or what have you that occurred on the 9th had resolved itself by then, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So yesterday during your direct examination, and I wrote this down, you said that this is not about politics. That's what you said, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and we agree this is about your behavior that night. So when you address the citizens of Monroe, as a council member and as a devoted member of this community, wouldn't you agree that the citizens of Monroe deserve respect from you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Wouldn't you agree that it is of the utmost importance that you do your job and hold yourself out with integrity?
That's correct.
Okay. And with that in mind, when you reflect on the events of September 9th, you agree that you did not act with respect toward everyone, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And wouldn't you agree that the citizens of Monroe deserve honesty from you?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So yesterday, during your direct examination, you were asked the question, Angelia, has the city of Monroe ever had an African American male? And your answer was, they have not, period. But ma'am, that's not true, is it?
No, the question was African American. I didn't hear if it was African.
Can you repeat just for all of us the question and answer?
Sure. So during your direct examination yesterday, you were asked the question, Angelia, has the city of Monroe ever had an African American mayor? And the answer that you gave was, they have not. And my question to you is, you know that that's not true.
Oh, you said male or mayor?
I'll do it again.
I'm sorry.
It's all right, and I'll get closer to the microphone. So the question that you were asked was, Angelia, has the city of Monroe ever had an African American mayor?
Oh, mayor.
And your answer was, they have not, period. And my question to you is that despite having testified to that yesterday, you know that that's not true, right?
No, that's my understanding. I don't know of a black mayor that the city of Monroe has.
How long have you lived in the city of Monroe?
20 years.
Okay, so are you aware that Philip Bazemore was the mayor within that 20-year period?
No, ma'am. I know he was on city council. Yes, ma'am.
Alrighty. So in support of your defense, you obtained a series of character affidavits or affidavits from character witnesses. Is that correct? All right, so I believe that they are being put into evidence, but I don't have them in my possession. So let me just ask you a couple questions about those witnesses, okay? So none of those character witnesses were present when you attempted to promote Officer Birchmore, right?
You talking about at the Fairfield, my home in the hospital?
That's right.
No, they were not present.
Okay. Were any of those character witnesses present when you attempted to promote and fire Sergeant Craig?
No, they were not.
Okay, were any of
For
those,
clarity on the record, can you state the names of the witnesses?
like the full name? Absolutely. Would you mind running back the last two questions and answers? I'll go back and clean it up.
Last two, you said?
Yes, please.
All right. So none of those character witnesses were present when you attempted to promote Officer Birchmore, right? Answer, you were talking about at the Fairfield, my home, and the hospital. Question, that's right. Answer, no, they were not present. Question, were any of those character witnesses present when you attempted to promote and fire Sergeant Craig? Answer, no, they were not.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just so the record is clear, were any of the character witnesses who are submitting testimony on your behalf, were any of them present when you attempted to promote Officer Brantley Birchmore on September 9th?
Well, let me make a correction, because one of the witnesses are Tony James, and he was present at the Fairfield in the home.
Okay, and for purposes of clarification, my question relates to when you attempted and engaged in that personnel action that night.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I don't, you were there, I was not. I'm just asking if any of those individuals who are character witnesses were actually present in a position to hear the personnel action that you took.
No, that's correct.
Okay. And as it relates to Sergeant Adam Craig, were any of the character witnesses who've given testimony on your behalf in this matter present when you attempted to promote and demote and fire Sergeant Adam Craig?
No,
As it relates to Lieutenant Nick Brummer, were any of the character witnesses who submitted testimony on your behalf present when you attempted to promote and demote and fire Lieutenant Nick Brummer?
no,
Were any of the character witnesses present when you attempted to promote Lieutenant Monique Holt?
no,
Were any of the character witnesses present when you attempted to promote Sergeant Mark Isley to police chief?
yes, Tony was present because that was at the home.
And when you say Tony, are you referring to your husband, Tony
That's-
James?
That's correct.
Okay. Is he present in this proceeding today?
No, he's not.
All right, as it relates to Chief Brian Gilliard, were any of the character witnesses present when you attempted to fire Chief Gilliard and or direct him to fire Captain Bolin?
No,
Were any of the character witnesses present when you attempted to fire Captain Bolin or when you reached for his badge that night at the Fairfield Inn?
no,
What about Officer Kendall Acoth?
no,
And what about Officer Andreas Bosnakis?
no,
All right, so the only character witness who may have been present for any of this was your husband, Tony James, right?
that's correct.
Because he's the one who picked you up from the Fairfield Inn that night?
That's correct.
Okay, but your husband's on camera saying that he hadn't seen you all day since you left that morning. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Are you saying that there's not a body cam footage video of him saying that he hadn't seen you all day since 5 a.m.?
No, he saw me when I came back to the house that day. Yeah.
Alrighty. So these witnesses provided testimony on your behalf about their belief of who you are as a person,
Yes.
right? Okay. Not their observations of your behavior that night, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and did you submit an affidavit from Tia Coleman?
I did not.
Okay, did you submit an affidavit from Kimberly Gordon?
I did not.
All right, if you just give me one moment to confer with counsel. All right, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Crum.
Angelia, I just want to make sure I understand a couple of things. You were asked whether you snatched the badge off of Captain Boland's shirt. You agree that the incident that Ms. Bright was referring to is recorded on body cam footage, is that right?
That's correct.
You agree that what the body cam footage shows is what happened, right?
That's correct.
And as it relates to any of the incidents that you were just asked about, you agree that to the extent they're captured on body cam footage, what the body cam footage shows is what happened, right?
That's correct.
You were asked questions about the contents of affidavits that you will be offering in evidence. Do you recall that?
I do.
You agree that those affidavits say what they say, right?
That's correct.
You were asked questions about the content of the City Council's Code of Ethics and City Charter. Do you recall that?
I do.
You agree that those things say what they say, right?
That's correct.
Thank you, Angelia. Those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Ms. James, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We call your next witness, Mr. Cottle.
Call Dan Cotterman. We will need to get Mr. Cotterman from the
Witness room.
from the room. Yeah. Thank you very much. Ms. McDowell, while we're waiting on the witness, I suppose now is as good a time as any. The rules of evidence do not apply to this proceeding. Under the rules of evidence, I would qualify this witness and then tender him as an expert. I intend, as we discussed yesterday, to go over his qualifications, but given that the rules of evidence do not apply, I'm presuming that I do not need to actually tender him as an expert witness.
You do not. I just want to leave ample opportunity for both sides to explore his background and qualification.
Understood.
I'm able to breathe again in my mask.
I'm sorry?
I said I'm finally able to breathe again in my mask.
That's good.
As this begins, it's always like a giant oxygen deficit.
Well, we at least get to take ours off up there. Sophia, check the restroom. Ms. McDowell, may I approach the,
Please feel free, yes.
these are witness affidavits, exhibits CC, DD, and EE for inclusion.
Thank you.
It's actually Angelia's. Here you go.
Have one printed. That's a CD. No. And that's it. Thank you.
Mr. Potter, join us.
Doctor, I'll have you raise your right hand and sworn. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the following proceeding will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Feel free to have a seat.
Will you please tell us your name?
My name is Dr. Dan Kotoman.
Dr. Cotterman, if you're comfortable, you can take your mask down while you're testifying. Dr. Cotterman, where do you live, city and state?
I live in Charlotte, North Carolina.
And you mentioned that you're a doctor. What kind of doctor are you?
I'm a forensic psychiatrist.
I'm sorry, what psychiatrist?
Forensic psychiatrist.
Thank you.
And let's go ahead and do this now. Where are you from, Dr. Cotterman?
Originally, I'm from Romania.
When did you come to the United States?
In 2001.
All right. You mentioned you're a forensic psychiatrist. Do you also practice general psychiatry?
Yes.
Can you tell us all what forensic psychiatry is?
Forensic psychiatrist is a science that bridges medical and legal world and educates courts about medical issues in psychiatry field.
And can you tell us what general psychiatry refers to?
General psychiatry is a science that take care of people's brain.
And where are you currently employed, doctor?
I employ in several places. I work at the VA. Also, I do have a private practice, and I work for a company called Locums.
All right. And what is do you treat patients at the VA?
Yes, I do.
You treat patients for all of those companies, is that correct?
Yes.
What's the name of your private practice?
The name of my private practice is South Charlotte Psychiatry.
And how long have you owned and operated that private practice?
Since 2013.
Dr. Cotterman, how long have you practiced psychiatry?
Since 2004.
And is that the time that you were admitted to the practice? You passed the bars and qualified to practice medicine in the United States?
Yes, sir.
And I said bars, forgive me. The boards.
Yes.
Since 2004, have you practiced psychiatry, general psychiatry, consistently since that time?
Yes.
And forensic psychiatry since around that time?
Forensic psychiatry since 2000. 2008 when I went to the forensic fellowship program.
Dr. Cotterman, let's go over some of your education and training. You were initially began the practice of medicine in Romania, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you went through, what kind of educational program did you go through in Romania in order to qualify to practice medicine?
I went to a military medical program, and I graduated in 97.
How many years did you participate in that program?
6 years.
After you graduated from that program and came to the United States, did you have any additional education related to the practice of psychiatry?
Yes, I went to the residency program.
And where was your residency?
It was at Wake Forest.
Is that Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem?
Yes, sir.
And how long was your residency at Wake Forest Baptist Hospital?
The residency program was for 4 years, and in my last year I was the chief resident there.
And what are the roles and responsibilities of the chief resident?
The chief resident is pretty much to make connection between residents and the attendings, and to oversees different rules and regulations that the residency program has to run by.
And after you completed your residency at Wake Forest Baptist Hospital, did you have any additional education or training related to the practice of psychiatry?
Yes, I went to a forensic fellowship program at SUNY Upstate in Syracuse, New York.
And this is a fellowship program, I think you said, specifically focused on forensic psychiatry?
Yes, sir.
What did you do? What kind of activities did that program involve?
In that program, you learn and you are exposed at different kind of legal issues. For example, for 1 year, we went to law school classes, and thanks God I didn't have to take any exam there. We work with different kind of legal issues. I used to work in different jails or prison system, writing reports about different kind of legal issues.
Dr. Cotterman, over your time in the practice of psychiatry, approximately how many patients would you say you've treated?
Well, I'm seeing approximately, right now I'm taking care of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 patients any given time, 20 years.
And the range, in the practice of psychiatry, you deal with people who are experiencing mental health issues, is that correct?
That is correct.
Mental illnesses.
Yes.
What kind of range of mental illnesses have you treated in your time as a psychiatrist?
I've been treating different type of mental illnesses. I would say almost all of them. Depression, bipolar disorder, psychotic disorder, substance use disorder, personality disorders, and different kind of medical issues also who looks like a psychiatric issue.
Dr. Cotterman, are you a member of any organizations in the field of psychiatry?
Yes, I am. I'm an active member of APOL, American Academy of Psychiatry and Law.
Do you currently hold any board certifications?
Yes.
What board certifications do you hold?
I'm a general psychiatry and neurology, and also forensic psychiatry.
And Dr. Cotterman, have you ever had any certification revoked for any reason?
No, sir.
Have you ever been disciplined by any regulatory authority?
No.
Dr. Cotterman, have you testified in legal proceedings in North Carolina?
Yes, I did.
And it's my understanding that most of those proceedings relate to involuntary commitment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that involves?
Involuntary commitment means when the patient is danger to himself or to somebody else, or cannot take care of himself, then the patient comes to the hospital or is brought to the hospital by the police or family members or by friends, sometimes by themselves. And when you offer to them hospitalization when they don't want, and you think that, again, they are dangerous to themselves, society, then you start the involuntary commitment procedure.
And Dr. Cotterman, when you testify in those procedures, are you asked to provide opinions as to whether those people present dangers to themselves or others?
Yes,
as well as to whether they have mental illnesses. Is that right?
yes,
Dr. Cottman, do you consider yourself an expert in the field of psychiatry
yes, sir, I do.
and the field of forensic psychiatry?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Cottman, have you been asked to provide an opinion in this case?
Yes,
All right, before I start asking you questions about the opinions that you have, I want to talk to you a little bit about the process by which you reach those opinions. You were retained by my law firm, is that right?
that is correct, sir.
And you have been paid to provide your services today, is that correct?
Yes,
You've been paid to formulate these opinions, is that right?
yes.
Can you please share your rates with everyone?
My rates are $600 per hour.
And is that consistent, Dr. Cottman, with the kind of charges that someone in your field and practice would charge somebody for this kind of work?
Yes, approximately.
And Dr. Cottman, did we ask you specifically to form opinions about whether Angelia James presently has any mental illness?
Yes,
And did we also ask you to form an opinion about whether Angelia James exhibited the symptoms of any mental illness on September the 9th?
yes,
And did you issue a written report concerning your findings and opinions?
yes, I did.
And in the preparation of that written report, did you interview Ms. James?
Yes,
Did you interview her on more than one occasion?
yes.
And during that interview, what kinds of questions did you ask Ms. James?
I ask standard questions that you are asking a client during evaluation. And I explained to her that I'm not a treating physician. I'm a forensic expert. And a written report will be provided, and the third party will have access to the report.
Did you ask her questions about what happened on September 9th?
Yes, I did.
Did you also ask her questions about her prior medical history?
Yes, I did.
Did you ask her questions about her experiences since September 9th and how she was feeling when you interviewed her?
Yes, I did.
And is that the kind of information that someone in the practice of forensic psychiatry would generally rely on in forming opinions?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Cottman, did you also review other sources of information?
Yes, I did.
You were provided some video, is that right?
Yes.
Video depicting the September 9th incident, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you reviewed portions of that video.
Yes.
You did not review it all because it's a lot of video.
Yes, and it's expensive.
And were you also provided copies of incident reports?
Yes.
These are the statements of the police officers who responded on September 9th, is that right?
Yes, sir.
As well as Ms. James's medical records including from that evening, is that right?
Yes, from Atrium.
Dr. Cottman, while you were forming your opinion, my office asked that you assumed that the role of council, a city council, is to generally make policy decisions concerning the city. Is that right?
That is correct.
Did we ask you to make any other assumptions?
No.
The rest of your analysis and opinions was based on what was contained in the information that we provided you. Is that correct?
Yes, and based also on the interview with Ms. James and with her husband.
And now, Dr. Cottman, in making a determination as to whether to diagnose Ms. James with any particular illness, did you rely on any reference guide?
Yes.
And what did you rely on?
I'm relying on our Apple reference guide, APA, DSM-5.
And can you tell us what is the
Up to
DSM?
date.
Can you tell us what the DSM is?
DSM is a manual that psychiatrists are using in order to follow the guidelines for certain specific diagnoses that we have to use.
DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, is that correct?
That is correct.
It is a widely used and accepted reference guide for psychiatrists, is that true?
Yes, it is.
It has been used in its various iterations over many, many years to diagnose mental illnesses. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
And DSM-5 is the current iteration of the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual,
Yes.
and it is the one that is now widely in use with forensic psychiatrists.
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, if you will turn, there should be a black exhibit binder before you there. If you'll turn to Exhibit AA at the very back of the binder.
Okay.
Dr. Cotterman, Exhibit AA appears to be a letter or memo issued from South Charlotte Psychiatry to Sophia Papalardo and Bo Caudle. Do you see that?
Yes.
Is this your report of your findings and opinions?
Yes, sir.
And are all of the findings and opinions that you have made in this case contained in this report?
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, before I ask you about the content of this report, there was one thing I meant to ask you earlier. When you were speaking with Ms. James, was she cooperative in that process?
Yes, she was extremely cooperative and polite.
Did she participate, do you think, in good faith in that process?
Yes, sir.
Did you get the sense that she was holding back any information?
No.
Did you get the sense that she was not being truthful with you?
No.
All right, Dr. Cotterman, I would like to look at Exhibit AA. If we could go to the second to last page of that exhibit, page 4.
Okay.
Page 4 contains a heading, Conclusions and Clinical Opinions. Do you see that?
Yes.
And Dr. Cotterman, you begin by saying, based on my observation during the interview with Mrs. James and her husband, it is my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that Mrs. James doesn't have a mental health diagnosis and she is able fit to stay on the city council as a city councilwoman. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, what does the phrase reasonable medical certainty refer to?
It means, in medical opinion, more likely than not, this is what I'm saying,
More likely than not, based on the information
that
provided.
I have at that time.
In other words, you think it is more likely than not true that the conclusions that are contained in this report are correct based on the
That is
information you
correct.
saw?
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, when you say that Ms. James doesn't have a mental health diagnosis, you're saying that as we sit here today, Mrs. James does not exhibit any mental illness. Is that right?
Yes.
In other words, she is not suffering from any ongoing mental health issue.
Yes.
All right.
If nothing changed since my evaluation, if everything stays the same.
Based on what you observed up to the point you issued this report?
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, the next paragraph says, based on Monroe police reports, incident investigation report, and case supplemental report, and Atrium health records, Mrs. James meets the criteria for a diagnosis of delirium. Did I read that correctly?
That is correct.
Dr. Cotterman, what is delirium?
Delirium is a medical term that we are using for clients who have change in their cognition and awareness. And when we don't know exactly why that happens, then we give this diagnosis, and then you have to do a lot of investigation to see why the patient has this kind of thing. And as of right now, we as medical providers know very little about delirium because it is hard to do all kind of investigations when a patient has delirium. Pretty much at the time you have to save his life at the time and to focus on that versus on doing research and putting all kind of wires or all kind of CT scan or MRI or do all kind of unnecessary labs in order to see what is going on.
Dr. Cotterman, delirium is a recognized mental illness, is that right?
It's very recognized mental illness.
It's referenced in the DSM-5, correct?
Yes, it is.
And what you're telling us is that we know little about it because while someone is experiencing delirium, it's difficult to test them, right?
Yes,
And to ask them questions and to get information from them. Is that right?
that is correct.
But we know that delirium is a mental illness that expresses itself in the population. Is that right?
Yes.
Under the DSM, Dr. Cotterman, what are the criteria for a diagnosis for delirium?
Some of the criteria for diagnosis of delirium is disturbance and in awareness and cognition happens in a very short period of time. And as I say, a lot of time is underdiagnosed and under-recognized even by people in the medical community, in the hospitals.
And Dr. Cotterman, you've listed the criteria for the diagnosis of delirium here. Is that right?
Yes.
You begin first with what you mentioned, a disturbance in awareness. Is that right?
Yes.
What does that refer to? A disturbance in awareness. What does that mean?
That means pretty much what it is a change from your baseline, and you don't realize what is going on, but people who are watching you from outside, kind of who knows you, recognize that something is wrong and your mind is not quite right.
In other words, that you're having some trouble perceiving what the rest of the people around you would say are the facts.
That is true. Pretty much you are out of your mind.
Dr. Cotterman, the next criteria is that the disturbance develops over a short period of time.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means will be during several hours, not longer than that. Mostly one day. And the time frame is very important, and it's helping you to make a lot of differential diagnosis between this condition versus other conditions.
In other words, if the condition didn't resolve within a day,
Yes,
you might consider a different diagnosis.
that is true.
The third criteria is an additional disturbance in cognition. Can you explain that?
Yes, disturbance in cognition, for example, in our case, can be change in perception, kind of paranoid delusions that otherwise you'll not make that kind of statements. In Ms. James' case, for example, she was seeing felons, which she later on deeply apologized because she knew that she was wrong, but at that time she couldn't recognize that. And unfortunately, nobody around her could recognize it, and that is the reason why she got in trouble.
Dr. Cotterman, the first criteria for delirium seems to have some relationship to the third criteria. So in other words, disturbance in awareness and an additional disturbance in cognition appear to have some overlap. Is that right?
That is true, yes.
And why are there two elements within this particular condition that seem to relate to the same sort of change in baseline?
Well, depends which source are you referring at. And this is taken from DSM-4. I'm sorry, DSM-4, DSM-5. And in order to kind of quantify what is going on, they had to come up with something and to put something in a paper in order for us to kind of speak the same language.
And to a certain degree, you're making a diagnosis based in part on not just the kind of the fact that a disturbance exists,
Yes,
but also the severity of that disturbance.
that is true.
Criteria 4 is that the disturbance, whatever it may be, is not better explained by some other condition. Is that right?
Yeah, that is very important.
And that sort of thing that's something that the DSM does. I mean, it kind of helps identify what the best diagnosis is, sometimes through a process of elimination. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then it says that there is evidence from the history and laboratory findings that the disturbance is a direct psychological consequence of another medical condition, and you list hypoglycemia. This is a requirement that there be some sort of physical trigger for this condition?
Yes, usually is a physical trigger that kind of trigger our change in the brain that will affect us and will make us to don't think correctly.
Now, Dr. Cotterman, you do not list exhaustion here as something that could have contributed. Do you think exhaustion could also be the physical trigger?
Oh yes, that can be very significant, and that's the reason why it's important to find the right person who is diagnosed and is treating you correctly about that. And as we discussed before, I will make a comparison with Michael Jackson case, who, because of lack of sleep, he chose a cardiologist to treat his lack of sleep. Poor choice. Unfortunately, the cardiologist didn't recognize that the problem, and because he was with lack of sleep for who knows for how long, he received some medication that he shouldn't, and that thing killed him, unfortunately. And that is the reason why, in Miss Angelina's case, she went with lack of sleep for a long period of time, and that lack of sleep and exhaustion and stress because of the election could have triggered this kind of event.
And Dr. Cotterman, just to sort of make sure I understand that, essentially doctors have a variety of specialties, right?
Yes.
And a doctor who is a cardiologist or has some other specialty has a tendency to view a particular problem through that lens, right?
Of course, yes.
And delirium is something that a patient experiencing it is, a doctor's going to be able to tell something is wrong,
yes,
right? But they're not going to be able to put their finger on it without the proper training.
Yes, and a lot of time doctors believe that they know everything. I mean, we know that we believe everything, almost like lawyers. And it's hard for them to accept that I don't know. And it's pretty much something is going on, but I don't know what is exactly the problem. And emergency room is a busy place where people want to save life. They don't have time to see really what is going on there.
All right, Dr. Cotterman, going back through these elements for just a moment. So first, if we're going to give a diagnosis of delirium, we want to see that there was some disturbance in awareness.
Yes.
What disturbance in awareness did Angelia James experience on September 9th?
Well, obviously, from videos and from the police report, Miss Angelina thought that she can fire a police officer. She thought that she can go to a particular person and call them a felon, and she wanted that person to be arrested, kind of way out of her baseline behavior, that she would not have done that if she would have been in the right mind at that time.
And that also goes to this third element, which we discussed earlier, which is that there be some additional disturbance in cognition. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
In other words, on excuse me, on September 9th, Angelia experienced more than one disturbance in her ability to perceive reality.
That is true, throughout the day.
Now, Dr. Cotterman, item criteria 2 is that it develops over a short period of time. Is that consistent with what happened with Angelia?
Yes, and may I add something else here?
Yes.
And she's almost by the book going with delirium, because this is this is the reason why the doctors are all of the time are missing it. It happened at night, and if you are seeing the patient, or in the evening, if you see the patient in the morning, then she's fine or he's fine, and then at night when you are not there, you receive all kind of unusual report, and it's hard for us to believe, really? I don't know. And that is the reason why a lot of time I pay extra attention to what my nurse is telling me, or what the other, like CNAs, is telling me, like what is going on.
But in this particular case, as you would expect with the onset of delirium, it seems to have resolved itself within a day.
Yes, yes. Fortunately for her.
And I think that raises a good point. I want to give you a chance to talk about this. I mean, is delirium a serious condition?
It's a very serious condition. It can be deadly. Now, think about poor Angelina went to a place where almost everybody knew her. She was trying to reach for an officer badge, for example. If it would have been somebody else who is not so well trained, when you try to touch him, maybe he would believe that the life was in danger and could use lethal force, for example.
In other words, this is a condition that can cause behaviors like reaching out to grab a police officer's
Yes,
badge.
yes,
Or pulling a face mask off of a police officer.
yes. Unfortunately, there was not somebody with good medical education to take her and say, hey, listen, you are out of your mind, let's go to the hospital, let's put you in a private room, let's solve all of that, and she'll have been fine. But unfortunately, it was not the case.
Dr. Cotterman, are the disturbances, this is the fourth criteria, are the disturbances that you found to satisfy criteria 1 and 3, are they better explained by some other diagnosis in this case?
In this case, not. I think the best case scenario is the delirium. And by the way, the police did a marvelous job taking care of her and of her son. I think they went even buy pizza.
You actually rule out some additional conditions, is that right?
Yes,
One of the conditions that you rule out is alcohol intoxication.
that's correct.
And why was it that you felt it was necessary to rule out alcohol intoxication, Dr. Cotterman?
Well, alcohol intoxication was written by another provider in an emergency room. I think he was. I wrote there some. I think he was a PA, and she had a small increase in her alcohol level, but it was so tiny that it could have been even from the alcohol when you clean the patient and then you draw blood, and probably she was agitated, and probably that was most likely the reason why the alcohol was high. She didn't drink any alcohol during that day.
This was a blood test that you're referring to, is that right?
Yes.
And the level of alcohol in the blood, was it sufficient for a person to be considered intoxicated?
No, it was very low. It was very low.
And you also rule out something called acute psychosis, and you indicate in your report that such a diagnosis doesn't exist. What do you mean?
Acute psychosis is not mentioned in DSM-5, for example. It's something that, like, even providers, we are using between us, but it's a kind of a slang. It's not, it's so broad that you have to be a little bit more specific in order to be scientific. But if I'm saying acute psychosis, I understand what people are talking about, but it's not quite specific diagnosis for a mental illness.
It's almost like a layperson term.
Yes, that is true.
And you say it probably should have been called brief psychotic disorder, is that right?
That is correct.
And why is it, in your opinion, that this case does not involve an episode of brief psychotic disorder?
You call a brief psychotic disorder if you cannot find anything else, but she didn't have any other investigation at the time to kind of rule out other major problem, kind of baseline problem that can be.
So to make sure I understand that, when diagnosing a brief psychotic disorder, you would not expect there to be a physical trigger for that disorder.
That is correct, yes.
In other words, the presence of the physical trigger is what allows you to rule that out.
That is true.
Dr. Cotterman, you also ruled out unspecified bipolar disorder, is that right?
Yes.
And can you tell us what bipolar disorder is?
Well, bipolar disorder is a very severe condition that should last for several days. The patient will need hospitalization. Patient has mania, up and downs. Sometimes it's violent. It's not Miss Angelina's case, and usually it's kind of recurrent. It is not her case.
And so you ruled that out again because there was a physical or physiological cause.
Yes, that is true.
Dr. Cotterman, is delirium a chronic condition?
No.
Does a person who has experienced delirium in the past have a greater likelihood of experiencing it again in the future?
Not really.
Is delirium something that could happen to anyone?
Yeah, how about to any of us?
Does the fact that Angelia James experienced delirium on September 9th affect her ability to function in her everyday life today?
Absolutely not.
Would it affect her ability to serve on City Council?
Absolutely not.
Dr. Cotterman, thank you. Those are all my questions for you right now.
Pleasure.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kahneman.
Afternoon.
My name is Tara Bright, and for purposes of this proceeding, I represent the city of Monroe. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions related to the testimony that you just gave about Ms. James and her condition and your opinion, okay? All right, if at any point in time you don't understand me, please let me know, and I will do the same for you. And if you need anything clarified, you can let me know that as well. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All righty, so one of the first questions that you answered was about your payment for this proceeding.
Yes.
And you testify that you're getting paid $600 an hour?
Yes.
Okay, how many hours have you contributed to working on this case?
I will have to look specific. Usually my manager is keeping up the hours, but I did work for several hours.
Okay, so you're getting paid for your testimony today, right?
Yes.
The travel to get here, obviously.
I'm discussing this with the attorney, and he said that he's going to take care of those things.
All righty, and then also you said you conducted some sort of records review in this matter, right?
That is correct.
All right, so let's talk about what you reviewed. Outside of the police reports and those documents, you said you reviewed records from Atrium Health, is that right?
That is correct, ma'am.
Okay, how many pages of the Atrium Health records did you review?
Well, I'll say probably 100 something.
Okay, and the approximate 100 records from Atrium, do those all relate to Ms. James's treatment and care on September 9th leading into September 10th?
That is correct.
So currently, you are not Ms. James's treating psychiatrist or physician or anything of that nature, right?
That is correct.
Right, and you've never been anything of that nature for her?
That is correct.
All right, the first time you met her was actually this month, is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay, and this month is approximately 4 months after her episode back in September, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so when I say you met her, you talked to her on Zoom, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, and you also talked to her by phone?
Yes.
All right, have you ever met her before today in person?
No.
So this is the first time that you've even been in a room with her?
Yes.
Okay, so you'd agree with me then that there is probably a lot about Ms. James that you do not know as you sit here today.
May I add something?
Can you answer the question first, and then feel free to add?
Yes, but this is a hypothetical question and is not related to our case.
Well, I think it's very related. You're here to give an opinion on, whether Ms. James is able to serve in the same capacity or what her ability is. So I'm asking you, I bet there's a lot of things that you don't know about her or her history. Would that be fair to say?
That is not exactly correctly, because I'm here to give an opinion based on Ms. Angelina's event on September the 9th.
Right, and I think you also gave an opinion that she absolutely may not have another episode like this going forward. So we're looking at her entire picture, isn't that fair to say?
This is a kind of a stretch, because we don't know. All of us can have another episode of Delirium in the future. We don't know.
Okay, so let me ask you, before meeting her or Zooming with her, you had no personal knowledge about what her medical condition was. Is that fair to say?
Not really.
Okay, not at all.
No. I say I don't agree with what you just mentioned.
Okay, so let me clarify then. Prior to meeting with her on Zoom, you had never evaluated her before.
Well, I was seeing the records that was sent to me by the attorney.
Okay, so the attorneys pulled specific records for you, and that's what you reviewed, right?
Yes.
And that's only related to one night of Miss James's life, is that correct?
That is correct.
How old is Miss James?
I think she was born in 1977. I have to do the math. No,
Okay,
sir.
so of her approximate 40-plus years in existence, you only took a look at one night of medical records, is that fair to say?
Is not really correct, because I think I had enough time to kind of form an opinion based on speaking with her and with her husband about what was going on before and after that.
That wasn't my question. My question was, of her 40-plus years of existence, did you only review 1 day worth of medical records? And the answer to that question is yes, isn't it?
I'm trying to think. Yes.
Okay. You also indicated that you spoke with her and her husband to get an understanding of her bigger picture. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you really had to rely then that the statements that both of them were making at the time that you discussed them were 100% true, right?
Well, it is difficult to say 100% true, but based on what they were saying, I think it was true. They were reliable people to me.
I'm asking you if, to form your opinion, you had to rely on the records being accurate and the statements that she made to you as being truthful and accurate.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's because if patient gives you an inaccurate history, then your opinion can be inaccurate then. Is that right?
That is true.
Okay, so you discussed Exhibit AA, which is your report in this matter. It's the report as it relates to Miss James, right?
Yes.
Okay, in that report that report contains your assessment, your conclusions, and your clinical opinions about her condition, right?
Yes.
Okay, so everything that was important to your opinion is in this report, right?
I will say what is important to this matter that I was asked is in the report, yes.
Okay. In this report, it actually indicates that you took a second meeting with Ms. James at the direction of her counsel.
That is correct.
Okay. Did her counsel tell you when to meet with her?
No.
Did her counsel tell you what to put into your report?
No.
Okay. Did her counsel have any input into what you wrote in this report?
Yes.
Okay. Can you describe what their input was?
They took a look to the report and they corrected grammar mistakes.
Okay. So they took a look at your draft report and actually changed it.
No, they didn't change. They corrected a few minor things.
Okay. And a correction is a change then
Yes.
to your draft. All right. All right. So we know that you didn't perform any psychological evaluation on Ms. James the night of her incident.
correct.
But there is an indication that one was performed on her. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Sure. While you did not perform an evaluation on Ms. James on the night of September 9th,
Yes.
somebody else did.
Yes.
Okay. And in your report, you indicate that that institution was Atrium, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And you also indicated that the physician's assistant, Brandon Morgan, is the one who wrote down her diagnosis of acute psychosis, right?
Yes.
Okay. In your report, you then indicate that what he probably meant was that Ms. James suffered from brief psychotic disorder.
That is correct.
Okay, so what that essentially translates to is you calling into question the accuracy and the reliability of those records.
Not really.
Well, you said what he probably meant, so you're not certain that he got it just right. Isn't that correct?
I think Mr. Brandon is trained for the acute emergency things, and probably he overlook minor minutiae which can change the diagnosis in a big picture.
Okay, so Mr. Brandon Morgan got the diagnosis wrong, and you think you know what he meant. Did you reach out to him to identify what he actually meant, or
No.
did you just guess in your
No.
report? Okay. All right, so let's see here. You knew that Ms. James was treated at Atrium Health while she was having this incident, right?
Yes.
Okay, you knew that the medical staff there evaluated her, ran a series of tests, and then actually prepared a series of records because you reviewed them, right?
Yes.
Okay, did you speak with anybody at Atrium Health to
No.
discuss what occurred?
No.
All right, earlier you also testified that in preparation for your testimony, you viewed some body camera footage from the police, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Were you aware then through the body camera footage or through your discussions with Ms. James that she was evaluated by emergency medical professionals while at the Fairfield Inn that night. Did you know that?
I think so.
Okay. Did you know that she was also evaluated by different medical professionals while she was at her residence that night?
Yes.
Okay, so in total, she was evaluated on 3 separate occasions that night.
Yes.
All right, and despite being evaluated by 3 separate sets of professional or medical professionals, you didn't even try to get an understanding of what any of those individuals who actually witnessed her having this episode saw.
That is not really true.
Well, you wouldn't know that because you weren't there, right?
Well, I took a very deep and careful look to the records that were provided to me by the attorney, by her attorney, and I asked on several occasions the attorney to give me all the documentation that he thinks are important for this particular case.
All right, so let me make sure I have this straight. You didn't evaluate her on the 9th, right?
That is correct.
Okay, you didn't speak with anybody who evaluated her or observed her having this incident on the 9th, right?
That is correct.
Okay, you relied on that one day of medical records, right?
Correct.
Okay, and those medical records that you relied on, you don't think that they are 100% accurate because you question the very diagnosis they're in.
That is correct.
All right, so despite all of that,
May I add something?
I think that we're going to move on because
No, no,
He should be
no.
allowed to finish his answer.
I think you finished it, but sure, go ahead and
Go ahead
add
and
something.
then feel free to.
Okay, you said that I'm not 100% accurate. I'm not saying that I'm not accurate. Are probably correct in their opinion, but when you look from my lens, I'm a highly trained forensic psychiatrist that I have plenty time to think, to talk, and to review the records. Then I can pinpoint a little bit more deeply what is specific for this case, in Angelina's case.
So they didn't get it right, but you did.
I didn't say that they didn't do it right. For them, it was important to stabilize Miss Angelina, to make the other patient safe, and then move on. For me, what was important to see what was going on for her in that particular night, and I had plenty time to discuss with the attorney, to review the records, to think. Then I woke up next day, I wrote again, then I discussed. I have much more time than them at that time.
All right, so you gave an opinion that Ms. James suffered from delirium due to hypoglycemia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, and that's based in part on the fact that she didn't eat that day, right?
That is correct.
Okay. You're aware that she had a smoothie at 10 a.m., is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay, are you aware of a conversation that occurred between her and the chief within 2 hours of consuming that smoothie?
She has had some conversation with the police officer. I don't remember from the top of my head when was that, but I do remember that she had.
Okay. Do you know at what point in time that day she had her first conversation with members of the police force?
I think it was sometime in the afternoon.
Okay, and although it's not in your report, you're now saying that this delirium due to hypoglycemia can also be triggered by exhaustion. Is that what you said?
That is
correct?
correct, yes.
The other thing you said was that this was an isolated incident, right?
Yes.
Okay, would it change your opinion if you learned that it was not the first time that she had an incident like this?
No, it's not going to change my mind. You can have delirium once, twice, several times in your life.
Okay, but as it relates to your opinion that this was an isolated incident, if she had had an incident like this in the past, then had another one, it's not isolated anymore, is it?
Well, depends what was another time. But as I said, it's possible for somebody to have delirium today and to have another one 10 years later or 20 years later.
Okay, did Ms. James inform you that she had had a previous incident when you had your evaluation with her?
Yes.
Okay, where's that in your report?
I think
Yes, feel free to look at it. Mhm.
May I talk?
Yes, you can answer my question.
I'm sorry, what?
I said you can answer my question.
Can you rephrase can you say it again, the
Can you
question,
read back
please?
the question, please, ma'am?
Question, where is that in your report?
It is not in my report.
Okay. On your direct examination, you also indicated that the likelihood of this happening again is low.
Yes,
Okay, but isn't one of the risk factors for having an episode of delirium that you've had one in the past?
it can be.
Okay, so if she had one previously and then had one on September 9th, then there is quite a potential that she could have another one.
Well, you are assuming that she had before delirium in the past.
Well, if you diagnosed her as having delirium on September 9th,
Yes,
that's in the past.
that is true.
Okay, so there's a potential that, given that that's a risk factor to have another episode, that she could have another episode.
Like for all of us, true. Like all of us can have delirium episode in the future, true.
Okay, so if she is exhausted or doesn't eat all day again, there's a potential, right?
This is for all of us, yes, that is a potential.
Okay, so, whatever your opinion may be as to the likelihood of this occurring again for her, you would agree that that's speculative, right? Nobody knows for certain what's going to happen tomorrow.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, all you know, as you sit here today, with 100% certainty, is that on September 9th, Ms. James engaged in the behavior of what she's being charged.
No, it was most likely than not. It's not 100% certainty.
Well, the behavior's on camera, so the behavior occurred, didn't it?
Yes, that happened.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Yes.
I actually have a few questions, and so if you're comfortable with this, Mr. Cottle, I'd like to pose them now so that you would have an opportunity.
I would very much appreciate you questioning the witness. I would reserve the right to object with the utmost respectfulness to any particular question.
Absolutely understand. I just want to make sure that we have some additional information in the record. So, Dr. Kahneman, how long did you speak with Ms. James when you spoke with her by phone and by Zoom prior to meeting her at this hearing?
I think it was in the first appointment was 2 hours, and the next appointment was anywhere between 30 minutes and 1 hour, something like that.
And those were the only two incidents prior to the hearing?
That is correct.
And how long did you speak with her husband?
With your husband, probably for 15 minutes to 30 minutes, something like that, in the first incident.
Okay, and the second incident?
I didn't speak, in the first interview, and in the second interview, I don't recall speaking with the husband. I think I spoke just with her.
All right. And as it relates to the potential prior incident that Ms. James may have occurred with her that wasn't in the report, did you learn about that from Ms. James, her husband, or both?
I think I learned from her and also from reviewing the records.
All right. And how much time did you spend speaking with her about the prior incident?
For a few minutes.
What can you tell us about your opinion about the prior incident?
I don't have enough data to say an opinion about that incident. It was a time when I think, if I'm correct, she was in church and she was having some arguments regarding some particular thing, and the God was talking to her. She's a very religious person. Probably she was stressed, I don't know.
Did you endeavor to get any additional information about that prior incident?
No, because I don't think that it was relevant to the case that we are talking at hand right now. It was for a very short period of time. Then Ms. James was able to function as a business owner, was able to function as a council member. She was very reliable. She was very involved in the process of of running for the mayor of Monroe. To me, she seemed very reliable. I didn't have to dig in a little bit more in order to see what was going on there.
So that was a short period of time. Was that also approximately a day, or was it some longer period of time? We don't have that information in the record, and that's part of the reason why I'm asking.
Yes.
So how long?
I would say probably 4 hours, just from my memory, if I'm correct.
Okay. And then you mentioned that you had reviewed the atrium records from September 9 and September 10.
That's correct.
But Ms. James did testify that she did speak with other professionals, one in October, Ms. Tia Coleman. Did you review the records relating to that discussion?
I was trying to get the records, but the attorney couldn't get the records on
Okay.
time.
But you did speak with Ms. James about that?
Yes, we spoke about it. And Ms. James said that didn't diagnose her with a medical condition, but I wanted to run the case through her attorney if the attorney would give me the permission to look to the records, but they didn't get it.
Did you reach out to Ms. Coleman to consult with her?
No, when I'm doing through the attorney.
Okay. Same questions about Ms. Jordan that was seen on Election Day. Do you know what the reason for that visit was on Election Day?
No, I don't know.
And then I think my last question is about the hypoglycemia as a trigger.
Yes.
How long does it take? I just am not sufficiently informed about this. We do have information in the record that Ms. James ate the smoothie, which
Yes.
is, not exactly a square meal, but ate the smoothie at 10 a.m. In your medical opinion, when would hypoglycemia kick in after that? Because there is an issue of the timing here, and just want to understand.
Well, this depends, and everybody is different. Look into the whole picture, Judge. She came from a very highly stressed period. Somebody died in her family. She was running for the election. She's kind of very honest and good person, and she was putting her heart and soul into that election process, and that can be quite drowning for you. And also in her private life, she wanted to buy a house, another stressful process. She woke up very excited that day, and all of those could trigger that hypoglycemia. And I would say maybe if you don't eat for half a day, you can run into hypoglycemia.
Okay, so essentially, if she's eaten at, we'll call it 10, I think the record testimony is that it was in the morning. But
Yes.
we can go back and definitely check this. You would expect that even with stress triggers, you would be looking at several hours, and I think you said 6 hours, before you would see a manifestation
Yes.
of that as
Yes.
a trigger.
Yes.
Okay, so if there were concerning conversations before that, how should we view that in your medical opinion?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Yes, so if there were any concerning conversations before that 6-hour window,
Okay.
trying to understand how we should view that, because that wasn't really addressed in the report, so just want your opinion about that.
First of all, I'm not saying 6 hours. It's give or take, half a day or something like that.
Sure.
But, well, if that happen again, please eat something when you run for an election or when you're in a very stressful event, buying a house or things like that.
Okay. Those were my questions. I appreciate your patience. Council may have questions as a follow-up to the questions that I posed. I appreciate you entertaining them.
Thank you.
Dr. Cotterman, just a few follow-ups for you. First, with respect to hypoglycemia, if a person were to wake up at 5 a.m. and not eat until 10 a.m., is it possible that they could be hypoglycemic during that time period?
Well, that is the reason why we have a coffee break, right? Because you have coffee, you put a little bit sugar, and otherwise you can be a little bit dizzy. Oh man, I didn't eat anything today. It's possible.
And in addition to hypoglycemia, there are other things that could have triggered the onset of delirium that are present in this case, correct?
Yes.
Including exhaustion.
Yes.
Dr. Cotterman, you were retained on fairly short notice, is that right?
Yes.
This proceeding all is happening very quickly, is that true?
Well, it's supposed to happen yesterday morning. I was then at 2 o'clock, and then I got a phone call to come today.
Yes. Nevertheless, you have interviewed Ms. James on 2 occasions, correct?
Yes,
Do you feel like you've spent sufficient time with Ms. James to reach the opinions in your report?
absolutely.
Is the amount of time that you took speaking with Ms. James and asking her questions and getting information from her, is that sufficient in your opinion? Is that the kind of information that forensic psychiatrists would ordinarily rely on?
Yes, absolutely.
You were asked questions about your disagreement with a diagnosis in the medical records. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Your disagreement with the diagnosis of acute psychosis?
Yes.
Dr. Kotteman, is acute psychosis a medical term?
No.
Is that a recognized condition in the DSM?
No.
As a forensic psychiatrist or in the practice of general psychiatry, would you ever diagnose someone with acute psychosis?
But you can, but they are not going to pay you for that.
In other words, there's another more correct term to use, is that correct?
That is correct.
And that is brief psychotic disorder, is that true?
Yes,
And that's what's indicated in your report, correct?
that is correct.
You were asked questions about relying on information from one night of Miss James's life to evaluate her. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You looked at things beyond the single night of Miss James's life, right?
Yes.
You considered other information.
Yes.
Those are all my questions, Dr. Codman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cottle.
We're all set, thank you.
You don't have a question?
Nope, I'm all set. You can take us back down. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Cottle.
You
free
can
to
leave that there. Thank you very much.
We appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Ms. McDowell, we have tendered the exhibits CC, DD, and EE, which are the witness affidavits, and with those, we rest the council member's case.
Thank you, Mr. Cottle.
All right, we're prepared to proceed with closing, but we just request a brief recess before we begin.
That makes good sense. How much time would council like to take?
I would very much appreciate 15 minutes so that we can review our notes and just make sure.
Absolutely. If 20 is better, let us know. I know I'd rather you guys have the time to be
Would it
prepared.
be better if that's acceptable
Yeah,
to the
20
city?
is preferable. That's right. And now that both cases are closed and the witnesses can no longer be called, are the witnesses permitted to come back into this hall?
Absolutely.
Okay, so 20 minutes it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Adjourned for now.
May the city proceed with its closing argument?
Yes.
All right, and before we begin, I know we have 30 minutes for closings, so I'd just like to reserve the remainder of my time for any rebuttal. And I'll have my colleague keep time. Ms. McDowell, Mr. Cottle, and Ms. Pappalardo. At the beginning of this hearing, I stood before you and I told you that this case boils down to one singular question. And that is, on September 9th of 2021, did Ms. James engage in misconduct in office? And as you've heard from multiple witnesses, including Ms. James herself, and as you've seen with your own two eyes through the video footage, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. The record consistently and indisputably establishes that on September 9th of 2021, through her words and through her actions, Ms. James engaged in inappropriate, offensive, and disrespectful behavior that violated the Code of Ethics, a code which she admits was applicable to her conduct as a sitting council member. Through her words and her actions, Ms. James attempted to exceed her authority in violation of the city charter, the statute which dictates very clearly that council members do not have the authority to direct city employees, and that only the city manager has the authority to appoint and remove officers, employees, and department heads. So by engaging in conduct that violated the code of ethics, by engaging in conduct that violated the city charter, and by engaging in conduct that violated the decency that is expected from our council members when they are in the community, Ms. James is subject to the consequences of her actions. So while she may contend that she did this because of a delirious event, that does not change council's right to remove her for her conduct. I mean, think about it. If you show up to work in some type of inebriated state of mind and you engage in conduct that violates your policies, you can be fired. And while we are sympathetic to Ms. James having a bad day that day, it does not change the fact that she did what she did and that she can have consequences as it pertains to doing those acts. So we have met our burden in this matter. We have proven to you that on September 9th of 2021, Ms. James held herself out as a council member, and she used her position to try and promote, demote, and fire city employees. People who have devoted their lives and their professions to serving the citizens of this community. That is how she treated them. And as the Honorable Madam Hearing Officer knows, and as is confirmed by Judge Gale very clearly in the case of Berger versus New Hanover County, the law in the great state of North Carolina confirms that the City Council has the inherent power of Amotion to remove an elected official when there's reasonable and just cause, such as the misconduct in office that has been proven time and time again through these proceedings. So we submit to you that given the facts established and under the existing law in this jurisdiction, the City Council has every right to remove Ms. James from her seat as a council member. We submit that to you because of the testimony of every witness who has taken the stand. So you heard from Officer Brantley Birchmore, and you heard from Officer Birchmore that Ms. James caused a disturbance at the Fairfield Inn and Suites on Williams Road on September 9th of 2021. That while she was there, she accused innocent black men of being felons, demanding their arrest and directing the officers to engage in a warrantless search of the property. You heard Officer Reagan Broom. You heard her testify that, when they declined to act on Ms. James's demands, that Ms. James got into her face, said some pretty harassing things, and then announced that she was on City Council and that they needed to respect her authority because of that. And from then on, Ms. James attempted to utilize this power and her notoriety to take a series of personnel actions which she admits exceeded the bounds of her authority, actions which she admits she was not authorized to do. So you heard from the Chief of Police himself, and Chief Brian Gilliard told you that not only did she direct him to retire on a date certain, but she then threatened his employment if he did not comply with her directives to fire his captain. Right? Chief Gilliard told you that Ms. James then called him again and again and again to follow up on her threats and to proclaim that he was fired and that Sergeant Mark Isley would be the new chief effective immediately. Right? You heard from Captain William Everett Bolin as well. And Captain Bolin told you, and the video very clearly confirms, that Ms. James not only threatened that he was going to lose his job, but she actually called the very man who could make that happen. Right? Ms. James picked up her phone, called the Chief of Police, and told Chief Gilliard to fire Captain Bolin and to do it now. She then threatened, if you don't do it, you're next. So it is undisputed that Ms. James attempted to rip off Captain Bolin's badge off of his uniform, proclaiming that he wasn't a captain anymore. Ms. James herself is on video proudly proclaiming that she fired the Chief of Police, that she fired his captain, and that she promoted her choice of officer to the chief. So if this hostile environment that she created wasn't enough, she also aggressively told officers that if they did not like her choice in who the new chief was, that they would no longer be on the force either. So this conduct did not stop there. She proceeded to promote, demote, and fire other officers, including Lieutenant Brummer, Sergeant Adam Craig, Officer Andreas Boznakis and Officer Kendall Akoff. And you heard from Officer Akoff yesterday. You heard that he had a wonderful relationship with Councilmember James before this incident, before she assaulted him that night. And you also heard from Ms. James herself that she has not even apologized to the individuals who she offended. She has not apologized to Officer Akoff for assaulting him that evening when he was just trying to help her out as a friend and as a respected council member. So instead of apologizing for her actions, outside of whatever self-serving statement she may have made to the Inquirer, outside of not taking the time to address the people and the city employees that she offended that night, she didn't take the opportunity to thank everyone for their patience in dealing with her that night. And as her own expert said, the officers did a marvelous job that night. But as you'll remember, Ms. James's counsel asked a lot of questions of the officers as to why they didn't cite her or why they didn't arrest her that night, why they didn't criminally charge her. So on one hand, we have him asking the witnesses, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you arrest her if she was that ridiculous? And then on the other hand, he's asking the officers, why were you engaging with her? Why weren't you more hands off than that? So whichever way you shake it, Ms. James's entire defense has been to shift the focus off of her actions and onto those of other individuals. Right? The officers are not on trial today. The individual whose conduct is at issue is Ms. James. The individual who stepped out of line that night was Ms. James. Now, in addition to trying to shift the focus off of her actions, her defense was to try to excuse her conduct by way of a delirium by hypoglycemia defense. So even if you are tempted to entertain that defense, despite the expert confirming that he doesn't really know her, he just met her, he only reviewed one night of medical records, and he formulated an opinion based on conversations and records that her attorneys directed. Even if you're tempted to entertain that defense, you know that the delirium takes a moment to kick in. You know that Ms. James had a smoothie at 10 a.m. and that within 2 hours of that, she was already engaging in this misconduct. She was already calling the chief of police and directing that he retire effective on a date certain. So when focusing on what is actually at issue in this proceeding, whether she was at the hotel, at her residence, or in the hallway of the hospital that night, Ms. James attempted to take unauthorized personnel action on so many different occasions that it's probably hard for you all to keep count. And the thing about it is, we don't need to count, right? Whether she committed one bad act or 100, one is enough to constitute misconduct. And her misconduct in office has its consequences. Her actions had consequences to Officer Akoff, and that is evident by his statements in his complaint to Human Resources that is in evidence under the T. Leitner letter exhibit. Her actions had consequences to Sergeant Craig. Her actions had consequences to every officer who testified yesterday. And her actions had consequences to the city as well, who has now been put on notice of a potential lawsuit because of her conduct. So we understand that people have bad days, and nobody is saying that Ms. James is a bad person. But what we are saying is that her actions have consequences. Her words, whether she now regrets them or not, have consequences. Leaving her in a position of power after having so publicly engaged in this behavior comes with consequences to the city as well. So whether Ms. James was tired that night, whether she had low blood sugar that night, she still engaged in misconduct. Whether Dr. Cotterman, someone who is essentially a stranger to her, believes that she is likely to repeat this behavior or not, it does not change the fact that she engaged in it. So as is demonstrated by the petition and Amotion, essentially the charging document in this case, this proceeding and the grounds upon which the city contends Ms. James may be removed are exclusively related to her misconduct in office on the night of September 9th. Ms. James unequivocally attempted to take unauthorized personnel action against many employees of the city of Monroe, which violated her charter. Ms. James harassed, berated, disrespected, and assaulted a laundry list of people, including citizens of this community and officers who serve this community. And that violated her code of ethics, in addition to the normal expectations of a council member or a person who shows respect. So it's her words, her actions, and her choices that started this entire incident. It was her words, her actions, and her choices that constitute violations of the Code of Ethics and the city charter. And it's her words and her actions and her choices that night that justify her removal from office. So on behalf of myself, my co-counsel, and the city of Monroe, we ask that you make a finding that the evidence supports and that the law dictates, and that is that Angelia James, through her actions on September 9th, 2021, violated the duties associated with her office, a finding which justifies her removal from council. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bright.
Earlier this afternoon, while Dr. Cotterman was testifying, counsel for the city attacked his testimony and his credibility based on the fact that he didn't know Angelia James very well. She spent a great deal of time asking him about how much time he spent with her, noting that he was really looking at a single day in her life, records from a single day of her life. That is precisely what the city is now asking you to do. And with all respect, you don't know Angelia James very well. And for that matter, neither do I. And yet they still come before you today, and they ask you, on the basis of one day, to recommend that city council, at the most 6 people, excluding Angelia, vote to remove her from office as a city council member. They want you to look at 16 minutes and 44 seconds excerpted from hours of body cam footage. That's 16 minutes and 44 seconds excerpted from the over 18,144 hours that Angelia has been in office, and recommend that the city council use those 16 minutes and 44 seconds, together with the testimony you heard today, to recommend or to remove Angelia from her office as a city council member, to effectively override the 1,200 people who voted to put her into that office, and to effectively ignore the more than 700 people who, knowing about all of these events, showed up and voted to elect her to the office of mayor. Not to mention the rest of her life and everything that she has done to raise her family and take care of it, to operate her business, to serve as a member of the community, and to get on to city council and to act as a leader of this community. And if our local elections are going to have any meaning, if they are going to enable people to rely on and trust in the power of the vote at the local level to make change, if we are going to believe that people have the right and power to participate in local government on equal footing, you must not recommend that Angelia be removed. Because if the city has good grounds here to remove Angelia James from office, no vote is safe. If they have good grounds here, this council, any council, can remove any elected official at a whim. On September 9th, Angelia had a mental health episode, and that caused her to act bizarrely in many ways, including being rude to some police officers. And now, believe Dr. Cotterman or not, let's take the testimony of every single person that the city presented yesterday. Every single one of them testified that based on their training and experience, something was wrong with Angelia when they interacted with her on September 9th. You should reject out of hand any finding, any notion that these police officers understood Angelia to actually have the power to demote or fire them. Everyone in this case, every single person that they put on the stand testified that they knew that was not the case, except for one person, Officer Akoff, who said he wasn't sure. And you should reject that testimony as not credible, given that Officer Akoff has been a Monroe police officer for 8 years, given that he reviewed the employee handbook and acknowledged that he reviewed it, given that he acknowledged that it was part of his obligations in that office to understand the city's personnel program, and given that in the entirety of that 8-year period that he's been on the force, he could not think of a single time that the city council ever hired, fired, demoted, or promoted an individual police officer. But in addition to that, you can consider Exhibits I and J, HR 19 and HR 20, concerning the multi-tiered process the city must follow in order to fire, demote, or discipline any city employee. You can also look at SOP 56, that is Exhibit V, concerning the multi-tiered process for promotion within the Monroe Police Department, as well as Exhibit Q, which is the chain of command, which shows who people report to within the Monroe Police Department. All of these are policies that every officer testified they were familiar with, that they were familiar with the policies and operating procedures of the Monroe Police Department. In addition, the body cam footage and the testimony depicts these officers treating Ms. James's so-called directives and commands as what they were, what Officer Birchmore called fantasy. That's what they understood them to be, fantasy. These officers know their policies. They know that Angelia could not fire them on September 9th. She could not demote them. She could not even discipline them. And any effort to suggest that they felt or feel that their jobs were threatened by Angelia James. I mean, many of these officers, after the fact, filed formal complaints with the city. And not only did they file those formal complaints, they made those complaints public. That is not the conduct of people who fear reprisal from an individual council member. So any effort to suggest that they felt threatened is nothing more than a reverse-engineered, trumped-up, self-serving effort to secure a payday from the city's taxpayers and vengeance against Angelia James, who they now perceive to be their enemy. And that is really, truly unfortunate that they have that perception, because Policy 75, Exhibit X, tells these officers, as part of their training in crisis intervention to deal with people with mental illness, that they should not expect a person suffering from mental illness to be able to engage in a rational conversation. In other words, they should expect that person to say and do strange things. But they have taken these things that Ms. James did on September 9th, and they have treated them as intentioned personal attacks, when in fact they have a better explanation, a clearer explanation, an explanation that is consistent with everyone's testimony, every witness's testimony, and that is that Angelia James was suffering from a mental illness on September 9th.
Dr. Cotterman has explained that. True to these officers' observations, Angelia was experiencing a mental health crisis. She was physically and emotionally exhausted as the result of both a lack of sleep and high-impact stressors, including a mayoral race, looking for a new home for her husband and son. She had not had much to eat that day, and so she had an episode of delirium, which caused her to do strange things, consistent with what happens when someone has delirium. Think of all of the strange things she did on September 9th. She showed up to the Fairfield Inn and Suites because she was concerned that she might argue with her husband about buying a house that she knew she could not buy. She shows up at the Fairfield Inn and Suites and begins accosting random people and saying, "You're a felon." She tells police officers that God told her that there were felons in the Fairfield Inn and Suites. This is not the behavior of a person who is acting normally on that baseline that Dr. Cotterman talked about. As Dr. Cotterman explained, nothing that happened on September 9th or since indicates to him that Angelia is unfit to serve in the role of council member. Now, this is important. Dr. Cotterman testified about the risk that a person might recur, that this sort of illness could recur. And he explained that even if a person has a history of delirium, the fact of the matter is that each of us are at the same risk for delirium. He testified that every single person, every single one, can experience delirium if the conditions are right. This was a one-time incident, and there is no more likelihood that it will recur with Angelia James than there is for anyone else in this room. Nevertheless, the city wants you to allow that incident to define Angelia James. And it's truly unfortunate what has happened here. This incident has been captured on body cam footage. It's been shared with the public. It will live on the internet for all of time. You've heard the police officer's perspective on that. Certainly, they feel that they were treated poorly on that day. But now Angelia James will live the rest of her life with an episode of mental illness portrayed for the entire public. That is a very difficult thing to live with. Nevertheless, here now in this decision-making process, we should not let that incident define her. Here's why the city claims that she should be removed. First, they say that she attempted to exceed her authority as a council member. And they say that by so doing, by exceeding her authority, she committed misconduct in office, but that does not logically follow. As the Berger Court explained, misconduct in office relates to the official duties of the office. It must relate to the official duties of the office. And an attempt to act outside of your official duties, of your official authority, cannot be misconduct in office. Nevertheless, misconduct by its very nature implies a degree of culpability that simply was not present here. Angelia James was affected by mental illness. Her behavior was affected by that illness. Everyone testified that they knew that something was wrong with Angelia James at the time that she was making these statements. Everyone testified that they knew on September 9th, except for Officer Akoff, who we've discussed, that she could not take those actions. And they all testified that those actions were not actually taken. They are all still employees of the Monroe Police Department at the exact same level that they were on September 9th. Misconduct in office means an abuse of authority. To abuse authority, you have to have authority. Angelia James has no authority, none, to fire, hire, demote, or promote or discipline an individual police officer with the city of Monroe. And not a single witness identified at any point during the testimony that you heard any instance in which City Council has ever taken that sort of personnel action. Not one witness. Second, the city claims that Angelia failed to behave consistently and with respect toward everyone with whom she interacts. And that is part of the code of ethics for city council members in Monroe. But again, the city omits a vital limitation on that provision within the code of ethics. The code of ethics says that that provision applies as council members exercise the duties of their office. Angelia James was not exercising the duties of her office on September 9th. She was in a distressed mental health state. She was the subject of police officer assistance. She was not acting as a council member for the city of Monroe. She was not doing anything that council for the city of Monroe does on September 9th. Third, the city claims that Angelia failed to recognize that council members are not generally allowed to act on behalf of the council without official action as a body. To be clear, the Code of Ethics does refer to a recognition of that fact. But what it says is that recognition of that fact is consistent with the Code of Ethics. It does not say that failing to recognize or failing to always recognize that provision is itself a violation of the Code of Ethics, and those are two different things. Even so, Angelia did not attempt to exercise any official duty, and that provision applies as well. That must be within the exercise of official duty. City council simply does not hire, fire, or demote individual police officers. They don't do that. Fourth, the city says that Angelia failed to act as a responsible citizen whom others can trust and respect, and that is plainly untrue. Angelia suffered from a mental health episode. That is all. The idea that an isolated mental health issue could make a person untrustworthy and unrespectable is offensive to modern society. Even putting aside that mental health issue, the idea that the Code of Ethics means that as a council member, you should never be rude to someone on pain of removal from office is one that I would think should make all city council members quite nervous. If we consider the Parker Poe report, less than 10 years ago, Monroe City Council had created an atmosphere of such mistrust that it was necessary to hire a law firm to conduct a sweeping investigation into council's practices. And what did that report find? That several council members, including a current council member and the mayor who signed the resolution to begin these proceedings, that they had been consistently rude toward city employees, consistently engaged in nepotism in violation of city policies, and consistently exerted official influence on the actual hiring and firing practices of the city, including within the Monroe Police Department. Unlike with Angelia, the conduct of these council members occurred repeatedly and consistently over a sustained period of time and actually included the influencing of personnel decisions. Unlike here, every officer testified, Chief Gilliard testified, Angelia's statements on September 9th did not influence him. He took no action based on those statements. Also, unlike with Angelia, the council members who stood accused at that time were white insider politicians. So unlike with Angelia, that report, despite its findings and conclusions, did not result in any Amotion proceeding. The issue was left to the voters, the citizens of Monroe. And here's the thing about that. That was the right thing to do. That's what this is all about. These are issues to leave to the voters, the people of this city. They should decide. Who are we to substitute our judgment for theirs? We believe that race has played a role in the initiation of these proceedings, the conduct of the officers in the city after these proceedings, but whether that's true or not, the fact is that if they remove Angelia James, they will be removing the city's only African American council member through a non-democratic process. Giving the city what they want, findings and conclusions and a recommendation in support of removal, will hand them carte blanche to take an action that doesn't just undermine the vote that put Angelia in office. It will frustrate and chill participation in local elections in this city going forward. Democracy is an act of faith, and if you take away people's faith that their vote matters, they won't vote. Let the voters decide. In 2023, when Angelia's term runs, let them decide whether to put her back in office. They have the evidence. They'll watch this proceeding. They'll see what you've seen, what City Council will see. They'll hear this argument. They'll hear the city's argument. They can take that into consideration. They can decide what to do with that. We patronize them by inserting ourselves into that process, that choice. Protect that choice. Protect the people's faith in local democracy. Recommend that council vote no on removing Angelia James.
Thank you, Mr. Conlon. Right, are your colleagues going to be helping you keep your time there?
Yes.
You don't need-
Here's that I have 15 minutes left. So what council just got up here and attempted to say to you all was that because Ms. James was at the Fairfield Inn and not in a council meeting at that moment in time, that there's no way that her conduct could be considered misconduct in office. Essentially what he said was because she didn't have the authority in the first place, that she can't abuse the authority. But what that sounds a lot like is an admission that she abused her authority. And that's because she stepped outside of the bounds of her power as a council member. And the issue of whether or not she was in office, whether that constitutes misconduct in office, whether she is in a council meeting, at a community event, or speaking to individuals in the community and directing their actions, she represents herself as a council member when she shows up. And not just that, she specifically stated to people, I am a council member. You need to respect my authority, as she directed their conduct. So the question as to whether she was in office or not, it is clear. She was in the community, directing police officers to engage in a criminal investigation. She was on the phone with the chief of police discussing where the department was going. She was telling anyone and everyone who would listen that she was a council member and expecting that because she was a council member, certain things would occur. So she did exercise her conduct while in office. She did engage in these misdeeds while in office. And the other thing that should be noted is that she has admitted to every single thing that is alleged against her. Right, and as we sit here concerned about, the citizens, the taxpayers, the people of the city of Monroe, we as a city need to ensure them that we have their best interests at heart. We as a city need to recognize that if we do not discipline council members when they act out of line, what type of message is that sending to our citizens? If we do not discipline individuals just because they're council members, just because they have power and authority and notoriety, what kind of message does that send to all of the city employees who work under them? So this is not about taking away the power of the vote or trying to demean the electorate. It is about protecting them. This case is about and has always been about holding her accountable for her actions. And as I mentioned initially in my closing, her entire defense has been a distractionary technique, right? The entire time, she's tried to say, I may have done this, but look over here. She's attempted to say, yes, I committed this bad act, but people are racist. And there really has been no testimony about racial issues, with the exception of the testimony that Miss James was the one who brought that up that night. Miss James was the one who has made that an issue. There's been no testimony that any of the police officers or city employees or Atrium Health workers said anything about her race or her ethnicity. But if you flip it, she is the one that has targeted and continued to use this narrative to become an inflammatory technique to distract everyone from the issues at hand. So the other thing that we need to make very clear is that the city has grounds to remove her. And whether or not they choose to do that is a decision that will be made at a later time. Right? But that does not remove the fact that based on the evidence that you saw, based on the testimony that you heard, there are grounds given her, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 20, not 30, but probably closer to that. All of that misconduct that she did that night. So, I asked the question, and I know it's going to go unanswered, but what are we supposed to do? Right? Do we just let her off the hook because she's a council member? Do we just let her treat city employees not only rudely, but do we let her assault them and not have any consequences? That's also something to be considered. So whether or not she actually had the power or authority under the charter to engage in the behavior that she did, she still did it, right? And she told us very clearly, I thought I had the power to do it. I thought I could talk to Officer Broom that way. And whether or not she was exhausted and had some bout of delirium, she still did the behavior that warrants the removal. Whether or not the officers knew at that moment in time that she didn't have the power under the charter to engage in the behavior she was engaging in, doesn't matter. The inquiry is, did you engage in misconduct? And the answer is, yes, I committed an assault. Yes, I told someone they were fired. Yes, I tried to take personnel action that I am not authorized to do. So the inquiry really stops there. Another thing council said was that, the officers have some sort of vengeance against Miss James. But I will remind you that they came and told their story because they engaged with her that night. They exercised hours and hours worth of patience to try to de-escalate and calm the situation from someone who was clearly and admittedly agitated and not in her right mind. Right? This is not their trial. This is not about them. They came to describe for you what they observed. But it's not because they have a vengeance against her. And if anything, the city council is the one who initiated the proceeding and initiated it based exclusively, as is contained in the charging document, exclusively on her conduct. Not anything less and not anything more. So while there are, tangential issues which appear to be influencing the way that Ms. James and her counsel think about this case, the case boils down to the very simple element of whether or not she stepped out of line. And she stepped out of line on multiple occasions that night. She violated multiple statutes. And the implication that her conduct was just rude is not only offensive to the people who were on the receiving end of that, but it's offensive to the citizens of the city of Monroe. And nobody should have to work in an environment where their boss's boss's boss can talk to them in a manner that demeans their decency and violates the established codes of their office. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bright. I want to thank everybody who has participated in this proceeding thus far. This proceeding is going to remain open. What that means for the folks who are watching this, both at home and in the gallery, is oftentimes at the end of closing arguments, you think that you're done. But this hearing is going to be open for a few more days at the bare minimum because there are some additional issues that council have agreed we need to continue to examine, and that might result in some additional testimony. If it does, then both council will have an opportunity to provide additional argument as well. So for now, the proceeding, this portion of the proceeding is completed, but the hearing itself is not closed. I just want to be clear about that for everybody who's watching. I want to thank every person who has participated. I want to thank every lawyer. A tremendous amount of work has gone into these arguments, these presentations. A lot of thoughtfulness and a lot of time and a lot of really good lawyering. The issues that are being examined here are of critical importance both to Ms. James and to the citizens and residents of this community. I know you all take it extremely seriously, as do we, and so I just again wanted to take a few moments to say thank you for the quality of the lawyering in this proceeding. If there are no additional, we'll call them ministerial, administrative matters, then I say we should conclude for the day, get everyone out before it actually might begin to snow in this community so everyone can get home safely. I assume, I'm going to ask this question to counsel for Ms. James. I assume that Ms. James does not have anything else that she would like to add?
Substantively, no. There is one thing that I would like to discuss with you, Ms. McDowell, and with counsel for the city related to a privacy concern, if we could approach.
You want to do that on the record? Or you want us to
I prefer
approach?
do it off if the city's okay with it. It just relates to the minor child that's involved.
Absolutely. Any additional matters before we conclude for the day?
Madam Hearing Officer, just as a follow-up to the discussion we had at the end of yesterday's session, given that the testimonial portion is definitely possible, additional testimony that may be needed later, do we have your approval to go ahead and post both days' worth of sessions to the city's YouTube page? That was a discussion we had yesterday, and I wanted to make sure that that was still the case, or if you have revised your information.
That's part of what we would like to just speak with you about very
Let's take a moment and we'll go off the record, have a brief discussion. We'll come back on the record to address that. All right, so back on the record, we've had a conversation about addressing some privacy concerns around a minor child. Council has agreed to a procedure for addressing that. Council for Councilwoman James will be providing an email summary and allowing the city the opportunity to weigh in on that summary. The two gentlemen, if you can identify yourselves by name, who are here assisting us from with videography, are going to work together to address those privacy concerns as quickly as is practicable. Gentlemen?
Peter Hovanek, Communications and Tourism Director with the City of Monroe.
Brett Troublefield with TCB.
Thank you very much. Anything else for the day?
Not for the councilwoman.
So, real quick from the city, so I know we held this open for the possible, and we're going to work on this, for the possibility of if they want to choose to look into bias
Yes.
in council members. So here's the issue. If we know that we're only going to have 3, that becomes easy, but we don't know that we're only going to have 3, and it might require bringing in all of them if they want to pursue questioning to explore bias. And I just put that out there as a potential complicating factor.
Understood, and that's the reason why I raised at the very beginning of the hearing, the timing considerations and how and when that would take place. Again, the only time that we have on the calendar currently is on February the 8th, but if the written response from the city is due on February 7th, that's really not going to give us the capacity to address that. we'll have to wait and see what we get in both sides of the briefing and what is ultimately, you know, appropriate in terms of what we will do on a going forward basis. But I think we need to be flexible with one another about that. So should we actually get to the place where we need to bring in some number of council members for limited bias examination, we need to make the time to do that as best we can so that we can get to a conclusion of this matter. But definitely understand that that is a complicating factor, and we've anticipated it, and we'll be waiting to see what we get in the written submissions.
And I guess my point, and I'm not asking for an answer or decision, but get folks to think about it. If you're inclined to rule that participating in the censure resolution is predisposition, and therefore, and then it would seem to me that they don't need to explore those folks. But the problem is that's a recommendation.
I understand.
So, and I'm open also to crafting something to give them an opportunity to also explore bias at the time this matter moves to the council, with sort of a voir dire of the council members at that stage of the proceedings, if the rules permit that.
So this is the exact reason why, number one, I want you to both brief the issues. These are significant concerns, right? So I want you to brief the issues, but I also want you to work together. It may be that you come with a proposal that we, based on our own research, feel like that might produce its own due process concerns or considerations, but we want to hear what you're able to fashion on your own, because ultimately we want to get to an outcome where you feel comfortable. We might not get there, right? There may still be some daylight, but there's a possibility of that, and want to leave the space for that.
We will confer with the city's council as early as possible next week to try to see if there's a way that we can resolve this and perhaps even avoid the briefing if we can come to an agreement.
And if it looks like you're close to that and you need additional time, by all means, reach out. I don't want you burning midnight oil on a briefing when you're a day away from a resolution.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.